Have you ever wondered what really sparked the Iraq War? The answer to this question lies in a complex web of events and decisions that took place in the early 21st century. Let's rewind to the year 2001. The world was a different place then. The new millennium was still fresh, and the idea of a global conflict seemed like a distant memory. But then, on a clear September morning, everything changed. The 9/11 attacks shocked the world, and the United States in particular was left reeling. In the wake of this tragedy, the Bush administration found itself in a position of having to respond, not just to assuage the grief-stricken nation, but to ensure such an attack never happened again. They turned their gaze towards the Middle East, a region seething with political unrest and religious tension. More specifically, they focused on Iraq, a country ruled by the iron-fisted dictator, Saddam Hussein. The Bush administration claimed that Saddam was harboring weapons of mass destruction, a threat they deemed too significant to ignore. This claim was supported by some intelligence sources, but disputed by others. The debate was heated, with both sides presenting compelling arguments. But in the end, the fear of another 9/11, the fear of a weapon that could cause destruction on an unimaginable scale, won out. It's important to remember that this was a time of fear, of anger, of a need for justice and security. The world watched as the United States, backed by a coalition of willing nations, prepared to take decisive action against Saddam Hussein's regime. The stakes were high, emotions ran deep, and the margin for error was slim to none. But the question remained, did Iraq really possess these weapons of mass destruction? Or was this a pretext for something else, something more complex and potentially sinister? The world held its breath, waiting for the answer. This scenario set the stage for one of the most controversial wars in recent history. The Iraq War, also known as Operation Iraqi Freedom and the Second Persian Gulf War, had begun. The consequences of this decision would reverberate across the globe, shaping the world in ways that are still being felt today. March 20th, 2003 marked the beginning of Operation Iraqi Freedom, but what catalyzed this decision? The wheels of war began to turn under the watch of President George W. Bush. The president, along with his cabinet, believed Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein was harboring weapons of mass destruction, and they felt it was necessary to disarm Iraq to ensure global security. The United States was not alone in this endeavor. Several nations, collectively known as the Coalition of the Willing, joined forces with America. Britain, Australia, and Poland were among the major players, backing the U.S. in their decision to invade Iraq. In the initial phases of the invasion, the coalition forces moved swiftly. The plan, named Shock and Awe, aimed to overwhelm the Iraqi military with superior firepower and speed. The strategy was to quickly decapitate the regime's leadership and minimize civilian casualties. While the military front was unfolding, there was also a significant diplomatic battle taking place. The U.S. faced substantial criticism from several international quarters, including some of its closest allies. France, Germany, and Russia were among the countries that openly opposed the invasion, citing lack of evidence of weapons of mass destruction and the bypassing of the United Nations. Back home in the United States, the public opinion was divided. While some stood by their government's decision, citing the need to combat terrorism and promote democracy, others protested vehemently against what they perceived as an unjust war. As the invasion began, the world held its breath. The media, with its 24-hour news cycle, brought the war into living rooms around the globe. The images of tanks rolling across the desert, of night skies lit up by explosions, and of soldiers marching into uncertain futures became indelibly etched into the collective consciousness. And so, the stage was set. The major players had made their moves, the first shots had been fired, and the world was bracing itself for what was to come. The world watched as the U.S. launched what would become a nearly decade-long conflict. As the war progressed, its complexity and controversy deepened. But what exactly happened? Let's take a closer look at the major milestones of this turbulent era. One of the most notable events was the fall of Baghdad. This happened in April 2003, just a month after the war began. Baghdad, the capital of Iraq and the stronghold of Saddam Hussein's regime, was captured by coalition forces. This marked a significant turning point in the war, signaling the end of Saddam Hussein's 24-year reign. But the fall of Baghdad was not the end. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter. The coalition forces now had to face the daunting task of restoring order and stability in a country that had been under dictatorial rule for over 2 decades. This was no easy feat, and it became even more challenging as the insurgency began to grow. The capture of Saddam Hussein in December 2003 was another key event in the war. Found hiding in a hole near his hometown of Tikrit, his capture was a significant victory for the coalition forces. It was hoped that his capture would quell the escalating violence and insurgency. However, the reality proved to be quite different. The insurgency didn't just continue, it escalated. The resistance was not just from Saddam loyalists, but also from various sectarian and ethnic groups. They were driven by a multitude of factors: resentment towards the foreign occupation, sectarian tensions, and economic hardship, to name a few. The situation was further complicated by the rise of terrorist groups who saw the chaos and disorder as an opportunity to establish a foothold. The violence and insurgency escalated to such an extent that by 2006, Iraq was on the brink of a civil war. The bombing of the Al-Askari Mosque, one of the holiest sites for Shia Muslims, by Al-Qaeda in Iraq, further inflamed the sectarian tensions. This led to a vicious cycle of violence and retribution, with countless innocent lives caught in the crossfire. The coalition forces were caught in a quagmire. They were fighting an enemy that was not just elusive, but also deeply entrenched in the society. The war had evolved from a conventional conflict to a complex counterinsurgency operation. The strategies and tactics had to be adapted accordingly, but this proved to be a challenging and costly endeavor. In the midst of this chaos and violence, there were also attempts to rebuild Iraq and establish a democratic government. The first free elections in Iraq in over 50 years were held in January 2005. However, the road to democracy was fraught with challenges as the violence and instability continued to hamper the reconstruction efforts. Despite some seeming victories, the war was far from over. The fall of Baghdad and the capture of Saddam Hussein were significant milestones, but they were not the end. The war had morphed into a complex, multifaceted conflict, with no easy solutions in sight. The fight was not just against an enemy, but also against the deep-seated issues that had been festering in Iraq for years. The war was far from over, and its repercussions would be felt for years to come. The war officially ended on December 15, 2011, but what did it leave in its wake? The aftermath of the Iraq War, or as it's also known, Operation Iraqi Freedom, was a time of upheaval and uncertainty. The war had left a lasting impact, and the cost was high, both in terms of lives lost and the chaos that ensued. Let's start with the most heart-wrenching statistic: the death toll. While the numbers vary depending on the source, it's widely acknowledged that well over 100,000 Iraqis lost their lives during the conflict. This includes civilians, soldiers, and insurgents. The war didn't discriminate, it took lives indiscriminately. But the death toll was just the tip of the iceberg. An even larger number of people were displaced. Millions of Iraqis were forced to flee their homes, becoming refugees in their own country or in neighboring nations. The war had torn apart families and communities, leaving a legacy of displacement that would take years to resolve. The political landscape was also drastically altered. Iraq's long-standing dictator, Saddam Hussein, was deposed. And while this might have seemed like a positive outcome on the surface, the power vacuum that followed led to a period of instability and conflict. Different factions vied for control, leading to sectarian violence and further loss of life. The economic impact was substantial as well. Iraq's infrastructure was decimated, with key sectors like oil production severely disrupted. The cost of rebuilding was astronomical, and the war-ravaged country struggled to find its footing. Unemployment and poverty rates soared, and many Iraqis found themselves struggling to survive. Beyond the borders of Iraq, the war had a global impact. It strained relations between nations and sparked debates about the legitimacy and consequences of such conflicts. The image of the United States in particular took a hit. Many around the world questioned the motives and methods of the war, leading to a surge in anti-American sentiment. The aftermath of the war was a period of turmoil and transition. It was a time of reckoning as the world grappled with the consequences of a conflict that had been both devastating and divisive. The scars of the war ran deep, affecting not just those who had been directly involved, but countless others around the globe. The end of the war marked a new chapter, but the consequences were far-reaching. The Iraq War served as a stark reminder of the cost of conflict, and the long-lasting impact it can have on a country and its people. The aftermath of the war was a testament to the fact that even when the guns fall silent, the ripple effects of a war can continue to be felt for years, even decades to come. The Iraq War has left a lasting imprint on global politics, but what controversies continue to surround it? The Iraq War, known to some as Operation Iraqi Freedom or the Second Persian Gulf War, has sparked numerous debates and controversies that continue to echo today. The justification for the war, the conduct of troops, and the handling of the post-war reconstruction are all subjects of intense discussion and disagreement. Starting with the justification for the war, the primary reason given by the United States and its allies for invading Iraq was the alleged presence of weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. However, no such weapons were ever found. This has led to widespread speculation and controversy over whether the real reasons for the invasion were strategic or economic, rather than humanitarian or security-based. The debate over the conduct of troops during the war is another contentious issue. There were reports of human rights abuses, including the infamous incidents at Abu Ghraib prison. These incidents have raised questions about the training, supervision, and accountability of troops, and have tarnished the reputation of the forces involved. Moving on to the handling of the post-war reconstruction, this is perhaps the most complex and controversial aspect of all. The reconstruction of Iraq was a massive undertaking, involving billions of dollars and a large international presence. However, many critics argue that the reconstruction was mishandled, leading to ongoing instability and conflict in the region. Some argue that the United States and its allies were unprepared for the aftermath of the war, lacking a clear plan for rebuilding the country and establishing a stable democratic government. The disbanding of the Iraqi army, for instance, is often cited as a key mistake, as it left thousands of trained soldiers unemployed and resentful, providing fertile ground for insurgency. Furthermore, the reconstruction was marred by allegations of corruption and mismanagement, with billions of dollars reportedly missing or unaccounted for. This has led to calls for greater transparency and accountability in the handling of such large-scale international interventions. Finally, there is the ongoing debate about the overall impact of the war. While some argue that the war achieved its goal of removing a brutal dictator and giving the Iraqi people a chance at freedom and democracy, others contend that the cost in lives, resources, and regional stability was simply too high. In conclusion, the Iraq War continues to be a source of controversy and debate. The justification for the war, the conduct of troops, and the handling of the post-war reconstruction are all issues that continue to be discussed and scrutinized. The Iraq War remains a contentious topic, with its effects still reverberating today.
So, what can we learn from the Iraq War? As we look back, the Iraq War, also known as Operation Iraqi Freedom or the Second Persian Gulf War, was a complex and multifaceted event. Its causes were layered, and its beginnings under the administration of a United States president were marked by both conviction and controversy. The war began in earnest in 2003, a time of tension and uncertainty. The pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, the quest for democratic regime change, and the nebulous specter of terrorism were all touted as reasons, each carrying their own weight and consequence. But the war was more than just its initiation. It was an ongoing process of conflict and change. As the years rolled on, the war took on new dimensions, new challenges, and new realities. The lines between enemy and ally blurred, and the objectives shifted, echoing the evolving global political landscape. The end of the war in 2011 was not a simple conclusion, but rather a transition into a new phase of aftermath. This aftermath was characterized by a host of issues, from the political vacuum left in Iraq to the ripple effects felt around the world. In reflection, the Iraq War stirred up a storm of controversies. The ethics of preemptive war, the validity of the intelligence used to justify it, and the handling of the post-war reconstruction are all subjects of intense debate. And yet, through all this, the Iraq War offers us valuable lessons. It serves as a stark reminder of the costs and consequences of military intervention. It underscores the importance of accurate intelligence and the perils of misinformation. It highlights the complexity of nation building and the challenge of fostering democracy in a land torn by conflict. While the Iraq War has ended, its impact and the lessons it offers continue to shape our world today.